even though this is our 9th Kennedy Center book of the semester, an idea which I must credit to our general education and honors program, we have been thinking about having someone come and speak on these issues of Islam and contemporary politics in the Middle East for some time. And perhaps it's owing to the fact that it is a difficult part of the world to understand. There are many complex and interconnected issues that it has taken this long for us to finally have someone come and speak on this topic. Some of the speakers who we had considered at one point now appear, their arguments appear to be much less credible than they did, and it's a very exciting and interesting time to talk about these issues. These are also issues that we aim in our book of the semester to reach a broad campus audience. We know here in the Kennedy Center we have a number of events that deal with various international interdisciplinary issues, but our aim with book of the semester is to cast a far wider net, to reach out across campus. For this reason, we make copies of the book available to deans and administrators on campus, and also working with departments and faculty who would have a particular interest in bringing them to campus. Past authors have included speakers as Joseph Nye, Jared Diamond, Jean Beth K. Elstein, Laurie Garrett, and Philip Jenkins last winter semester. And so we aim for kind of a broad interdisciplinary international approach that will bring in a core group of faculty and students from different colleges and departments, but also that will appeal to a general informed audience. I believe that there's something that everyone can like and also perhaps even take issue with in this book. We find this is an interesting book, but we really look forward to an informed faculty panel discussion to see what they think about it, and that's why we're here today. Let me just briefly introduce our 4 faculty panelists. Starting here at my far right, we have Glenn Cooper, Assistant Professor of History. All these faculty are from BYU, as you probably know. At my immediate right here, Professor Bill Hamlin, Professor of History. To my left, Professor Daniel Peterson, Professor of Islamic Studies and Arabic and the Editor-in-Chief and Director of the Middle East Text Initiative. And then to my far left, Professor Becky Lynn Schulzeis, who's an adjunct professor of anthropology, and she is, quite frankly, the reason that we were able to bring in Reza Aslan. I'm not exactly sure of the connection. I believe a graduate school connection as well, but in each of these events we appreciate the support of faculty in helping to sort of speed things along, and she was the key person in coordinating this visit. And we're very appreciative to her for that. She will also, from her seat, moderate the discussion from here on out, so I'm going to slip out of the way. But we've asked our faculty members to each make an opening statement, and then we'll have time, hopefully, for them to discuss amongst themselves, and then open it up for you. We, again, want to thank these faculty members for their time. This is just one other thing that has been asked of them, and but we do value them for their perspectives and their time and the effort they put in preparing this panel. So thank you, and please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Well, I hope you'll indulge me as I refer to prepared notes. It's that time of the semester, not to mention that time of life when you need these things, cribs, as it were. Now, I'm a scholar of Islamic science, the history of Islamic science, so I didn't find much in the book that exactly overlapped my field of expertise. And in fact, I found the book to be somewhat flawed in the area of history that I most deal with, namely the Abbasid period. But I'm not going to pick at it. That's not my purpose. What I'd like to do in my opening remarks is discuss how I might use this book in a general education course, of which I do teach, and I do emphasize Islam in my world civilization classes. I will make a general historical remark because I am a historian, and historians, if nothing else, we like to pick at each other's work. But he does skirt past the the period of my interest. And we find ourselves somewhat ahistorically leaping from the period of the Umayyads to the period of Al-Ghazali and the mystics and so on, and then leaping by leaps and bounds through the modern period with little vignettes. Now, I know that the purpose of the book is different, as I'll explain in a minute, but I did find that somewhat vertiginous. I had hoped to be able to engage him, and maybe I will when he's here in a couple of days, on issues relating to the history of science in Islam, or the attitudes of a civilization, of Islamic civilization in the modern period that has had a great history in science. Well, what is the attitude today, and so forth. Well, now, for using the book in teaching, I think that its non-academically oriented historical character is precisely why it would appeal to general education students. I think it would be very useful as an introduction to Islam as a culture and a civilization. I think that the author has presented us with an authentic account of Muhammad. By authentic, I mean a human one. The tenderness with which he describes the trials of Muhammad, of Ali, and the passion of Hussein suggests something much more significant than mere history. Rather, this is a work of loving engagement with his Iranian Islamic tradition, and both of those go together, those adjectives. Many passages in this book, as maybe you have discovered, were quite affecting and brought me, for one, to tears, especially those that described Ali and his sufferings and his trials. And Ali's been a personal favorite of mine among the early leaders of Islam, which is probably why it appealed especially. We have here a presentation of Islam in human terms, and with Aslan's own ability to speak with a Western thought and cultural dialect, he has expressed it in terms educated Westerners can appreciate. Note the glaring Yeatsian slouching toward Medina, and there are plenty of allusions to plays on Shakespeare, to plays on Shakespearean tropes and other authors that represent his American lit-hum education, which we might call general education. So Aslan in this book and in his other writings is a kind of cultural dragoman between Islam and the educated West. And the fact that he writes so well aids his case. I think a work like this appeals to a universal human spirit, and it doesn't need to be strictly history. It's a religious history, and this is probably why it appeals so much to me as a living believer. It's a history that is relived and continually made present once again in the lives of the believers, just as he so lovingly describes the passion of Hussein and the suffering of Ali, the reenactment of the passion, a particularly Iranian Shiite thing, of course. And it's not hard to see parallels with the Christian Mass and its redemptive effect on the participating believer. The truth of the story here that's told is not an academic truth. And so I would be disingenuous if I critiqued it too much in wearing my garb as an academic. But it is truer than true in the sense of a lived truth. It is a mythic truth in the classic sense defined by Jack Lewis and Ronald Tolkien and discussed by them late one autumn Oxford evening nearly 80 years ago when they discussed the Christian story. And Jack was concerned about being a believing Christian and how it didn't seem, the Christian story seemed to be too much of a myth. And Tolkien educated him and suggested to him that the Christian story is a myth, but it's a true one. It's true because it is relived every moment, every redemptive moment in the believer's life. And I think that the same applies to the Islam that is presented in No God But God. I think for this reason also, this book in particular and Islam generally has a special appeal to a Latter-day Saint audience. The mythic religious scenario that I have just described in my halting way is something that LDS people are particularly suited to resonate with. And it also suggests that Latter-day Saints may have a greater capacity to appreciate Islam than most Westerners. I refer to the most recent New Yorker article about Mitt Romney. It says that it characterized him as not wearing his Mormon religion the way Jack Kennedy wore his Catholicism. Rather, Romney is a Mormon in the way that the Kennedys are Irish. Mormonism is a complete way of life, just as Islam. It's not a belief set, which is a favorite Western post-Enlightenment way to belittle religion, i.e. religion is just a set of propositions that one can discard whenever something more intellectually appealing comes along. No, it is a complete way of life. It's a culture. It's almost, Mormonism is almost an ethnicity. Mr. Aslan's book gives us some of the sense of what it means not only to believe, but to live the world of Islam through its sacred history, and that, I think, is what makes it appealing to my students. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to say that I'm quite pleased that this book was written. I think it's very important that Muslims today, moderate Muslims, engage the radical view of Islam and provide an authentic yet moderate alternative to radical Islam that's causing numerous problems today in the world. And I find Aslan's book very positive in that regard, and I applaud him for his work. I think his book has two major purposes, and the first is to introduce Islam to Westerners, that is, to non-Muslims. And part of his objective here is to undercut a lot of negative anti-Muslim stereotypes that occur in Western media and Western books about Islam in some ways. His other alternative purpose is to provide an alternative paradigm for Muslims for what he calls the Islamic Reformation. I think Becky's going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but a different way to be Muslim and be authentically Muslim, and yet have a religion that is not involved in terrorism and jihadist efforts and things like that. And I think the book at that level is very effective and very positive. I think one of the problems is with the book is that in that second attempt is that he essentially provides he uses fundamentally Western forms of discourse. That is, he's an Iranian who fled Iran just at the time of the revolution and then was raised in the United States and educated in Western universities. And his book uses kind of Western intellectual, journalistic, scholarly forms of discourse. And I suspect that those aren't going to be very well received by the jihadists that he's, in a sense, trying to convert to more moderate forms of Islam. They use a different form of discourse centered around tradition and traditional forms of interpreting Islam and so forth. So there might be kind of a disconnect between part of his purpose and its effectiveness at part of his target audience. Another interesting thing about the book is that I think it is a form of Islamic primitivism. That is to say, it tries to go back to Muhammad and use him as a model on which to reform Islam, and then in a sense it doesn't ignore, but it plays down all sorts of intermediate interpretations of Islam and Muhammad from the time of Muhammad up to the present, and kind of jumpstarts this into this what he calls this Islamic Reformation. It's interesting in that regard that, in a sense, Mormonism does the same type of thing. I mean, it goes back to the time of Christ and says, we're focused on the New Testament, and then kind of skips intervening, 1700 years of Christian history, and then comes to the Restoration. And in a sense, he's trying to do the same type of thing for Islam. The other part of his paradigm or his view of Islam, beyond primitivism, that is going back to Muhammad himself as the model and the ideal, the problematic thing with that is that in some ways the jihadists are doing exactly the same thing. And yet they are idealizing a different aspect of Islam, a different aspect of Muhammad's life, and they branch off in one direction, and the moderates are trying to idealize Muhammad's life in a different direction. And they're both looking to the same person as their ultimate model, and yet come up with radically different ways to understand Muhammad in early Islam. So it's pretty paradoxical that, in a sense, Aslan's kind of moderate reformist attempts to deal with Muhammad are doing the same thing, that is, looking straight to Muhammad as the model, and yet coming up with an entirely different view of what Muhammad meant. That's kind of paradoxical, but I think that's probably what's going on here. I'd like to engage in the last couple of minutes one core idea, and that is the issue of jihad. He talks about this to some extent, and he recognizes that jihad means many different things in Islam, and it means different things at different periods and to different groups within Islam. So it's a very complicated idea that can't be dealt with in a few seconds. He grasps this and engages that in his book, but I don't think he fully deals with the implications of jihad as an idea in Islam. For example, he barely mentions the Arab conquests. I mean, a couple of paragraphs in the entire book mention that, and those were a fundamental earth-shaking impact of Islam, and they're intimately tied to ideas about the nature of jihad, and yet he just kind of skips those. I mean, he mentions, like I said, in a couple paragraphs. He also doesn't deal with apocalypticism in the early Arab conquest and the implications of all of that, as manifest in a book by David Cook and other scholars who deal with that. The fundamental problem here, I think, is that the Quran says different things about how you engage with non-Muslims and about the nature of jihad and struggle and fighting in the path of God and these different types of ideas. On the one hand, there are verses like, to you is your religion, to me is my religion, that Aslan emphasizes. These are kind of a moderate approach to non-Muslims and how to engage them. On the other hand, there's passages that say, kill all the infidels wherever you may find them, which, in my understanding of the Quran, probably both of these are kind of temporary things that the Quran is telling Muslims to do, depending on specific circumstances that they find themselves in Arabia. Are they at war with Mecca, or are they at peace with Mecca? I mean, what's the situation? Well, how they should engage the people in Arabia at that time changes, and so the Quran has different ways to engage that. But that's not the way the jihadists view it. They see the Quran as a book that is talking to all people at all time. And so they decontextualize these passages, and they emphasize the jihadist passages in the Quran and then turn it into a universal jihad. And Aslan takes the same Quran, emphasizes the pacifist parts of the Quran, and says jihad is defensive, and we have to get along with our neighbors and so forth. And both of those are absolutely there in the Quran, they're absolutely there in Islam, and yet, again, there's this paradox of turning to the same book, the same prophet, and coming up with radically different understandings of what the core message of the Prophet and the Quran was. And this is a problem that Muslims have to deal with. I mean, Westerners can talk about it and so forth, but Muslims are the people that have to deal with these issues, and that's why I think Aslan's book is so important, because here's a Muslim voice speaking for moderation, giving you a moderate view, the moderate interpretation of Islam, and that can only be very positive. My fear is that there's going to be a disconnect, that they're not going to be talking to each other, and that Aslan will have an impact in the West and among moderate Muslims, but it's not going to really have much of an impact on the radicals.
Let me say first off that I really like the book. It's very eloquent. It's an interesting tract, and I use that word tract deliberately and without meaning to downgrade it. I think it's an important tract. It can be seen as an argument launched out into the internal struggle, the reformation of Islam that he himself talks about in his last chapter. He's staking out a position. It's a very strong position, very clear lines, it seems to me. I, too, was moved by his very humanizing approach to Muhammad, to Ali, to various of the early leaders of Islam, of the Shia movement. there are a lot of things I liked about the book. In fact, there were more than a few places where I thought, gee, I've made that point. And I guess one reason I liked the book is that we agree on a lot of things. It reminds me of Ambrose Bierce's definition of admiration, which is one's polite recognition of someone else's resemblance to oneself. One of the things I liked about it was that it does, I think, depict, although this is not his major goal, it does depict something of the intellectual and ideological and cultural variety of Islam. It's a point that he makes explicitly at the end of the book, where he says that Islam is not and never has been a monolith, and I think that's important. Just today, I seem to be a lightning rod for these sorts of things. I got an impassioned email from someone saying that the reason that I'm interested in Islam, the reason Mormons have been friendly to Muslims, is that we share so many things, such as our oppression of women, our anti-intellectualism, and so on and so forth. I love this sort of email. They just arrive out of the blue. But yeah, the fact is that the tradition of Islam, that the culture of Islam is anything but anti-intellectual, although right now we're in a period where there are loud anti-intellectual voices that I find profoundly unsympathetic. So I'm very sympathetic to his goal of trying to remind people of what's out there in the Islamic world, that there are other resources in Islamic culture, that the model of Osama bin Laden hiding in the caves of Tora Bora is not the only model available to Muslims who want to bring their faith, or have their faith come to grips with the challenges of modernity or post-modernity. He reminded me of things that I knew but had not thought about for a long time. In graduate school, I read a fair amount of people like Jamaluddin Lafghani and Muhammad Abdu, but it's not my primary interest, and I haven't looked at them in many, many years. And I have to say, I didn't much like them when I read them years ago. They did nothing for me. Now, though, through his lens, I could see actually they do have something to say in the current situation. I hadn't thought about them in all these years, and they're maybe worth going back to again. Professor Hamblin mentioned that this book will probably not be well received by the jihadists. My bet is they won't read it, or if they do, they'll read it only to condemn it and him. But there is another audience out there, and I really do believe that in some ways the future of Islam will be determined not by people like bin Laden in Afghanistan, and not even by the Islamic Republic of Iran, but by what you might call the Islamic diaspora. People living outside of the heartland of Islam in places like Sydney and Los Angeles and New York and London. And so this book is a very important contribution to a debate that I hope is going on intra-Islamically about what the true nature of Islam is and how Islam ought to relate itself to what might be called broadly and somewhat inaccurately Western civilization. I like his idea of getting behind the traditionists, getting behind the Sharia as it was elaborated in the centuries after the Prophet Muhammad, because, of course, as he points out, and what I think something that I think ought to have been obvious all these years, is that while a devout Muslim is required to believe that the Quran was revealed, it is not necessary for a devout Muslim to believe that all of the jurists functioning in the years after the revelation of the Quran were in fact divinely inspired. They were no doubt good and sincere people trying to spin out what they saw as the implications of the Quran, the life of Muhammad. But why should that role of spinning those implications out be limited only to the first 3 centuries, and then the Bab al-Ijtihad, the door of interpretation, closed thereafter, when there are people today just as devout, just as learned, just as intelligent, just as devoted to the Islamic cause, but who have the advantage of living in our time and living in the new circumstances that we face. Now, as I say, overwhelmingly I like the book. Let me quibble a bit. I think it's the duty of an academic to quibble whenever possible. And so I will, not as much as I could, but just to pick up a few things that strike me. Very small things at first. I was a little bit put off by his description of the wealth and the status of Quraysh in the Mecca of Muhammad's lifetime. They were an important tribe. They were wealthy by the standards of pre-Islamic Arabia, but let's not overdo it. He talks about the unspeakable wealth of this tribe. Well, it was a primitive society living in mud huts around a brackish well. They weren't phenomenally wealthy. They wouldn't have been seen as phenomenally wealthy by anybody else, say, living in Constantinople at the time or in in China. When he talks about the ideology of the Hanifs, the sort of pre-Mohammedan monotheists, it seemed to me just a little bit too much. He was turning them into a kind of corporate movement, and that just doesn't ring true to me from the sources. It was a tendency, it was a trend, it wasn't an ideology, it wasn't a formal movement of any kind, so far as I can see. I was struck by the fact that in his very eloquent depiction of the evils of Western colonialism, which may have been, I think, slightly overdrawn, the British come off as not much better than the Third Reich. That's a bit much for my taste. But he does point to many of the evils that were done. The one quotation about the massacre of the Sepoy rebels in India is perfectly blood-curdling, I think, really appalling. And in its giving of the Christian imprimatur to that, just kind of sickening. But it's striking to me that by contrast, he says nothing about what you might call Arab imperialism in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. This is a much more complex historical situation than we typically than is often recognized. Two more weighty things, and they're related, I think. I was really put off, and I think everybody on the panel was, from what I understand, by his comments about the relationship of religious belief and history in the introduction. Let me just give you a flavor of that in case you haven't read this yet, which I hope you all have. Yes, he says, religion, on Roman numeral 25, religion is concerned not with genuine history, but with sacred history, which does not course through time like a river. And he goes on and on and on to ask whether Moses actually parted the Red Sea, or whether Jesus truly raised Lazarus from the dead, or whether the word of God indeed poured through the lips of Muhammad, is to ask totally irrelevant questions. Well, not to me. Those are really, really important questions. I understand this point of view. And I understand it from a certain point of view as being relevant. If you're doing only a kind of phenomenological study of the religion, you don't have to ask about the truth claims. But the most important question is the truth claims. I remember a very prominent non-Mormon historian of Mormonism who one night was sitting in my living room who said, he was just really sick of all these studies about Mormonism that concentrated on Joseph Smith as a prophet, and did he really see an angel? Were there really gold plates? He said, none of that's important. That's not important. The really important things are questions like the origin of the ward system in Nauvoo. I'm sorry, I just find that absurd. Maybe it's a matter of taste. But it seems to me the really big issues, the issues that grip human beings, are not questions about where the ward organization came from in Nauvoo and its relationship to city and municipal government or something like that. But did these things happen? Did Jesus really rise from the dead? That's kind of an important question to me. And so I find this approach interesting, but fundamentally, this is one I think that will turn off a lot of Muslims. They say, you mean you don't think the truth of the religion is important? I think the truth of the religion is important. So do they, and properly they should. Those claims are hugely important. Also related to that probably is his depiction of Muhammad as a reformer. He says he's arguing against those who say that Muhammad may have been influenced by his environment. And he says, all religions are inextricably bound to the social, spiritual, and cultural milieu from which they arose and which they developed. Like so many prophets before him, Muhammad never claimed to have invented a new religion, which is true, but he distorts it when he goes on to say, by his own admission, Muhammad's message was an attempt to reform the existing religious beliefs and cultural practices of pre-Islamic Arabia. Well, no, not at all, or not solely, or not largely anyway. Muhammad saw himself as restoring a revelation that had been given before to earlier prophets. He's not just there as a reformer of pre-Islamic Arabian religion. When he said he wasn't inventing a new religion, it'd be like Joseph Smith saying, I'm not giving you a new religion, I'm restoring what went before. He would never have said, I'm just trying to restore the Methodism and the Baptist faith and the Campbellite faiths of my environment, and I'm just, like Luther in his day. There's a difference between prophets and reformers. And in my own little biography of Muhammad, I actually addressed this quite eloquently, I think, although I can't remember what I said. I remember citing Max Weber and Georg Wiedeker and people like that to argue that there's a distinct difference here, that Muhammad is a prophet, not a reformer. Reformers are a different animal. They're a useful animal, but they're quite different from prophets. And so I objected to that. But I think, again, that's relevant to his claim that Islam is really not rooted in the historicity, the historical factuality of its claims is not important. It's just the phenomenological character of the religion that has a certain structure and gestalt and so on and so forth. That's important. For certain purposes, yes, but for ultimate human purposes, no, that's not the important issue at all. Nevertheless, as I say, overwhelmingly, I liked the book. I wish for it a lot of influence, not only in the West as an introduction to Islam of a peculiar kind, but more especially, I wish for its success within the Muslim community as an argument for a peculiar kind of Islam, one to which I'm quite sympathetic.
Well, the benefit of going last means that I get to address things that I thought were relevant that previous people have not, and there's actually quite a bit of joy in that endeavor. One of the things that I wanted to look at in Reza's book and that I found very, very interesting is the way he frames the whole thing. And as an anthropologist, and specifically as a linguistic anthropologist, I'm interested in form as much as content. So my particular response is probably going to be more along the lines of the form in which he takes his particular argument in the book itself. And specifically, I'm going to look at it within the frame that Professor Hamblin talked about of the idea of reformation and reform and how he looks at that. Mostly because I think that all writers position themselves in a text in some fashion. And I see Reza putting himself in the text in a very particular way by the types of themes that he chooses to look at, and also by the ways in which the mechanisms he uses to put that forward. As Glenn mentioned, the format of the book goes from very nice vignette to vignette, so that you get bits and pieces of history, but it's more often couched in a story that illustrates a point for which he's trying to argue. And one of the things I think that he does in the very beginning, briefly, which Dan has spoken about, is talk about religion and what it is and what it is not. And there's a quote that I want to read from that in which I think he kind of puts forward his mode of dealing with these issues. Religion is not faith, it is the story of faith, shared and institutionalized symbols, myths, and rituals by which a community can share their experience with the divine. Now, when he's writing this book, what I found really striking were the symbols that he drew upon. The symbols that he drew upon and the way that he drew upon them. In fact, he talks about prophets as being reformers who redefine and interpret the existing beliefs and practices of their communities, providing fresh sets of symbols and metaphors with which succeeding generations can describe the nature of reality. I see Reza kind of moving in that fashion. He's putting forward particular symbols in the ways that he deals with the idea of reformation and reform, and how Islam can deal with that. So one of the first things that I think he does is he situates himself as someone who is in the process of comparative religious study. So he is dealing with symbols in that fashion. And what's interesting is this idea of the analogy of the Reformation actually comes out of, ironically enough, comparative religious studies. It began in the idea, the analogy that Islam needed to go through a reformation or was in the process of a reformation comes out of the late 19th century scientific study of religion, in which people were looking at events happening in the Middle East, most often Protestants looking at events happening in the Middle East, and drawing parallels between the kinds of movements that were occurring and things that had happened in Christian historical past. So one of the first things that gets written about is the idea of the Wahhabi movement, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in Saudi Arabia being a reformer, someone who is trying to get back to the origins of faith and belief. And that was actually picked up very early on by Protestant comparative religionists. And Reza deals with that issue when he says, there are certain limits to the analogy of the Reformation when you're looking at it in the terms of Islam, because, of course, Christianity has a centralized, has, depending on your position, a centralized authority that was being challenged through the Reformation. And Islam doesn't necessarily, although there is a little bit of ambiguity as Reza deals with that in terms of seeing the ulama, the jurists of the medieval period, as the great evil people who confined interpretation and made it so rigid that nobody could access it except the very, very skilled. And seeing them as the ones who curtailed Islamic thought in moving in directions that could have progressed. But also seeing this as not being something that necessarily had to be reformed, as not a centralized authority that needed to be challenged. So there are some problems with the analogy in that regard. But there's also other issues. One of the interesting ways in which the idea of Reformation, Islam having to go through a Reformation, is the way in which Muslims themselves have picked up this idea and talked about it. The first examples that we see of this trope of Reformation, and the parallel, the analogy between Christianity and Islam, comes by modernists at the very early 20th century, in which they talk about the need for a Martin Luther, somebody who can take Islam away from the ulama, the jurists, and make it more of an individualized process of interpretation. But what's one of the interesting things about that idea is that the original adoption of the Reformation analogy doesn't go the way that we generally think it does. Within the Christian adoption of the analogy, it's that Islam has to become more like Protestant Reformation ideas, moving away from its rigid juristic positionality. Within Islam, they see Martin Luther as having moved Christianity closer to Islamic ideals of humanity, the fundamental goodness of humanity, and seeing this movement of the Reformation as being actually getting them closer to the Islamic belief and practice. So it's interesting how the analogy has been used on both sides of the fence. And Reza kind of draws a little bit, he certainly sees himself as drawing on that tradition of the use of the idea of Reformation, but he's definitely within the Western humanist tradition that has been mentioned previously, in which the idea is that there needs to be a reform, and it needs to occur in a way that decentralizes belief and makes it more of a personal practice and a personal interpretation. One of the ways in which I saw that emerging in his presentation in the format was his discussion, as you mentioned, about the Quraysh and their wealth and their status. And he really, it was an interpretation I hadn't seen before, in which he talks about one of the things that Muhammad was in reaction to was the process of sedentarization and economic wealth, and the accumulation of economic wealth had actually created greater divisions in society and greater status distinctions, and that people needed a reformer to come along and help equalize the disparities that were existing. And I thought that was really interesting, because that was in contrast to the tribes who were egalitarian, where no one was better than another person, the status was equalized. And I found that really interesting, because I think that that's part of what his agenda is putting forth this idea that modernity has enhanced, our access to wealth has enhanced disparity and inequality, and that part of the process of reform is getting back to this idea of egalitarianism and distribution of wealth along more equal lines. And I thought that his depiction was symbolic of the kinds of reforms that he is advocating in terms of his adoption of the model of Medina. So, and there are lots and lots of examples of that. And what I think is really interesting in the final analysis is that he is not alone in calling for reform from a Western humanist perspective. Any of you who read the New York Times may have seen in recent years an article by Salman Rushdie, the author of the Satanic Verses, calling for reform. There's also been Thomas Friedman in the New York Times called for Islamic Reformation. Fareed Zakaria of the Newsweek has also been calling for a reform of Islam. And then there are also those who believe that the Reformation's actually occurred and what we are in now is a counter-Reformation. That is the case of Ali, I can't remember his name, Ederaviz, who writes for The Guardian, who has argued that the Reform actually occurred at the beginning of the 20th century and that what we're now in is a counter to that Reformation that will lead us back to a more moderate view. So there are lots and lots of positions on the issue of the Islamic Reformation, and Reza certainly situates himself in that, and uses the book as a really interesting way of symbolically dealing with the issues that the Reform movement is trying to deal with. All right, so would any of you like to respond?
We've only got a few minutes left. Maybe we could open it to questions.
Open it to questions. Do you want to open it to questions? All right.
Up to you.
Can we have a few questions, please, Amr?
Yes, I just sort of
You could just wait for the mic.
I can shout.
No, we need to record it.
All right, you need to record. Just thinking about what you were saying on the whole issue of Reformation, I just reminded myself that Reza is Iranian, and by saying so, he's also probably Shiite. And therefore, the whole issue of Reformation and a central sort of authority and so on and so forth is much more akin to Shiism than perhaps Sunnism. So when he thinks of reform and the Protestant Reformation and sort of in terms of having a central authority that needs to be reformed, that would certainly fit more in with how Shiism operates and the idea of you have ayatollahs and you have supreme ayatollahs who are almost infallible, but not quite as infallible as perhaps the Mahdi himself. So that might explain why he's following that path, or why that becomes more applicable to him.
It might, because there are a number of Muslims who are calling, modernists who are calling for Reformation and draw upon that, who are Iranian and of Shia extraction. But however, they're not alone in that. There are a number of Sunnis who also call for that kind of thing. So it's.
But I would think it's probably slightly, if they come from different sides of the fence, I suspect.
Probably.
You know, in terms of what, because if you think even of your fundamentalist sort of more radical movements, they're also calling for reform, but their own version of reform. A sort of a fundamentalist going back to the straight path, going back to the original form, and as opposed to, and even if you compare those to the modernists of the early 20th century again.
Well, and that goes to what Bill had mentioned earlier about the fact that you can have the same information and take very different takes on it. You can.
I just think we need to make sure we understand that Reza's reform relates.
I would say that
that's how I read it anyway.
It does relate in some respects, but at
More
the same
to
time,
Shiism.
he is not as tied to Shiism as you might think.
Oh, okay. I don't know him personally. Because maybe I'm thinking of Sarouche as well,
and he draws on Sarouche, but not into wholly and
Okay.
completely. He does draw on other people as well.
All right, thank you.
Shahrur, he
Yeah. Well, Shahrur, yes.
has an extended
Yeah.
discussion of Shahrur. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
This question is for you, Professor Peterson. You mentioned that one of the things you disagreed with was Reza's way of seeing the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as a reformer. But wouldn't you think that, most Muslim leaders today in the world see the Prophet Muhammad as a prime example of a reformer of community and politically. So if we can't see the Prophet Muhammad as a reformer, what does that entail to Reza's idea of reformation in Islam, being that the Prophet Muhammad reformed, the entire Arab community, gender roles, social structure, even military, the concept of military and the unit, the ummah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's the danger of sort of shorthand talk in a very, very brief response. I don't mean to say that he was not a reformer. I mean to suggest that a prophet is a reformer plus. So yes, did he reform society? Absolutely. It's the most drastic reformation that Arabia ever underwent, one of the most dramatic reformations ever anywhere in human history. But I objected to to the author's approach to him as simply reforming the customs of pre-Islamic Arabia. I think Muhammad himself would not have seen himself as merely that. He was a prophet. He was restoring truths given to Adam, Noah, Moses, so on and so forth, Jesus. And so to describe him as simply coming in with a kind of reformation of the customary material that was there, drawing on the material simply in his environment. This is something I think most Muslims would not approve. That he's actually getting revelation from God. He's not simply reshaping the symbols of his environment, forming a new amalgamation of those things there. So that's why I wanted to say a prophet is probably, or often is, a reformer, but much, much more than that. Martin Luther is a reformer, but not a prophet. A prophet, Jesus, Muhammad, so on, will be a reformer, but more.
Yes, you kept going back to the idea of jihad, and I think for most Muslims, jihad is not so much at least jihadists, as you referred to them, are not so much religious people, and their religious arguments don't really sell there. What really sells is their political argument, and if they go back to history, they would usually go back to the history of the last 50 years, not any further than that. So I think that if people actually even support them, what they support is their political arguments, not so much their religious arguments. So how do you reconcile the two?
I think that's absolutely right in many ways. From my perspective, however, I don't think there's a difference between politics and religion in the jihadist point of view, that they're the same thing. I mean, they're intimately connected together. I think the issue is that there's a whole bunch of different ways that jihad is interpreted, and although they have a political agenda, they use jihad ideology to try to further that agenda, or one type or aspect of jihad ideology. So I think you're absolutely right. The jihadist movements have lots of different goals and lots of different things they draw upon, but ideologically speaking, jihad, or their view of jihad, is one of them, an important one. Kind of the idea, anyway, it's not the only thing, but it's an important part of what they're doing.